Now, while President Cyril Ramaphosa said that parties who signed the statement of intent were close to an agreement that will usher in a new era of politics for South Africa, signs of disagreements have surfaced. Now, accusations of the ANC's reneging from the agreement by the DA and threats to pull out have all been playing out in the public domain. ANC NEC member Ronald Lamola says that the DA's demands are outlandish and outrageous, while Nomvula Mokonyane said that the party should not impose its demands but appreciate that everyone serves at the president's behest. Now, with the focus on these two, where does this leave other parties? Let's now talk to the head of diplomacy and foreign policy at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Chris Landsberg, just to tease out some of these latest issues. Professor, good morning. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me again, Sakina.
So, since we last spoke, quite a bit has happened, but we haven't quite sealed this union. Seems like there's a bit of a problem with the prenup at this stage. But what are your thoughts on how things are playing out?
I think we are on the cusp of a deal. I expect this thing to be wrapped up on Sunday. Now, if I have to follow your narrative and the tone in which you introduce the topic, then yeah, I think it is rather disappointing that so many in the weeks leading up to the inauguration, the election of the president, followed by the inauguration, and of course this 2-week hiatus with lots of negotiations behind the scenes. It seems that it's been the so-called big two that have bedeviled things. And indeed, what makes it even more disappointing is that in spite of all the promises that things will be done in the name of the people, the national interest, something that I hope to write about and demystify, but what do we mean by the national interest? That at the end of the day, it did come down to a jostling for positions, and by one party in particular. And I hold a particular view about this this so-called representation, and on the basis of who got what number of votes, the proportionality. That's where we are. I think you are dead right that we are at the point and on the brink of one of those two parties, certainly not the former ruling party, having to decide whether it's going to walk out or stay in. My fear is that they can't walk away without them taking a heck of a lot of the flak and the responsibility for doing such a brazen act, if it comes to that.
So if we look at how these things have played out, the DA has been very consistent from the onset that they believe that they should get 30% of those cabinet positions, which of course in a cabinet of 30 ministers, 30% would be 9 of those portfolios. And they've kind of stuck to that. So the ANC coming back, possibly offering 6, and the DA pushing back, saying, no, you need to up that, is consistent with what they have been saying. So where is the problem? Is the ANC still trying to assert its dominance in this instance? And the way in which everybody is approaching this, would you say that they are all negotiating in good faith?
Okay, so Kira, do you agree with me that in one of the letters that were leaked earlier this week, we even saw the number of 12 and 13, 12 ministries and 13 on the part of the DA. You just mentioned 9. Now let's do the arithmetic. Very simple. I mean, I think this thing for me is much simpler if you go the proportionality route, even as the DA insisted it is ensconced in this terms of agreement, the letter of intent. So the last time I checked, that if the president was to keep the cabinet at 30, which the DA itself said it is a bloated cabinet. For me, the last time I checked, 20%. You mentioned 30, right? 20% of 30, last time I checked, equals 6. If you ask for 12, you have to have a 40-member cabinet. So 20% of 30 is 6. What seems to be the problem? And I wouldn't be surprised if that's the number that they are going to settle on. But of course, now we all are privy to letters doing the rounds, and they're asking for a bit of more than the 6 that have been offered. Let me tell you where I think the problem came in. The DA strategy was this should be from the onset an agreement between the ANC, the DA, and the IFP. Now, if there are only 3 parties, then of course the 30% would become more. If you've got more than 3 parties and you now have 10, then clearly 20% of 30 remains 6. There was some scathing language by that president in that letter. And let me tell you what's significant about the letter, Sakina. Thus far, the president left it to the negotiators, led by Fikile Mbalula, the SG with the ANC on his part, and left it by the leader of the federal party caucus on the part of the DA. But when he intervened himself, he almost reached a point of no return and said, it's that point again, like we reached with MK, time to pull down the shutters, here are the offers, take it or leave it, and we're going to move thing of moving out in front of the world, for which the world seemed to have so much sympathy, almost suggesting that there can't be a workable GNU in South Africa without the DA, then so be it. But that's for me where the problem started. They didn't anticipate 10. They're still bitter that there are more than 3 parties to this agreement. They certainly not in favor of certain parties, in particular the Gaten McKenzies of the world, and that's where the mala fides, as opposed to the bona fides, are creeping in.
So speaking of the other parties, because there are 10 parties who have signed on to this government of national unity, and where does it leave the other parties? Because at the moment, it's all about the ANC and the DA, and to a certain extent, the IFP. But where does it leave all the other parties, the other 7? Where do they fit into this?
Yeah. No. Okay, there was a very interesting statement in that letter by the president. And again, I'm saying to you, it was a riveting letter. Here comes the old Ramaphosa, the tough negotiator during the first GNU and during the negotiations of the final constitution. He drew a very interesting comparison after telling the DA that he doesn't accept these demands, and he even called it condescending and disrespectful. In the very paragraph, he lists all 8 other parties, all of them, bar the ANC and the DA. And he says to the DA, no other single party made such demands on us. They're waiting. We told them, when we're ready to announce, and we've decided on who gets what and who will not get anything maybe, they've said, it's your prerogative, Mr. President. And that's what he used as an example to demonstrate bona fides. I think that's where it's leaving those parties. And I have to say, they have behaved in a remarkably disciplined and respectable and quiet fashion, even behind the scenes. They talk to their caucuses. I suspect they talk to their people and constituencies. And that's where it's leaving them. But it did come back between a fracas between the DA and the ANC. And I want to emphasize, it's the 2 big parties, one in particular, that seem to have thrown their weight around. Now, allow me just this one point, Sakina. I think the DA should really reflect on views about its attitude, about how it is perceived, how it's perceived in elite political quarters, maybe in society. And just like the ANC is trying to fight back fight pushback in its own ranks, and the president has to explain them. Probably are being told now, I told you so. I suspect there are some pushback within the DA as well, certainly about approach and how the DA should learn to come across more with more magnanimity and more appreciative as a party with a certain predominant race group in a black-dominated society.
So if we look at how these parties have struggled to come to an agreement, because I think most onlookers would have thought that by now this agreement would have been signed and sealed. It hasn't happened. We're still waiting. And like we said last weekend, we were hoping that the president would announce his cabinet last weekend. Didn't happen. So maybe it will happen this weekend. Be that as it may, where does this leave these parties going forward? Because we haven't even started looking at policy positions at this stage. This is just, at this point, a wrangle about what is contained in the statement of intent and, you know, just trying to fashion out the cutting up of the pie. We haven't even got to the substantive issues as yet.
Yeah, but Skinner, then we must also understand and realize that we are dealing here with the subject and the practice of this thing called politics, which is all about the struggle for power and the struggle for resources in society and how you conduct it. What the president was alluding to, that we've become accustomed to doing things in a certain way. Of course, they had 30 years where they could have been more magnanimous the way they are right now. So I can make two predictions for you with a degree of confidence. The two parties will realize that they need each other, as Prof Stephen Friedman said in a debate that I had with him last night on a sister channel of yours, or sanity. Right, they need each other, and sanity will prevail, which I really think that's where we heading for, and we will see by tonight. Certainly, the climate comes down and the temperature comes down, or the worst case scenario of the Democratic Alliance of all party walks out. And I just want to add something to that. I've been scanning a lot of the international media yesterday, and this notion of that people have coined a market-friendly pact seems to be reverberating throughout Germany, Switzerland, the UK, France, elsewhere, and they've almost bought into the idea that without the DA, South Africa is no way, and the Titanic will be sinking. There are no other parties. And I was shocked when some analysts even says we don't have any other choice. Of course there are choices. The problem with those choices now is that the EFF
All right, our apologies there. At that point where the Prof was going to tell us about the EFF, we seem to have lost that link. Prof, I see you back there. You were talking about the different scenarios, and the one about the EFF is where we lost you.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that it seems that Western powers and certainly the Western media have bought into this idea that South Africa cannot have a credible pact without the Democratic Alliance, that we are all beholden to the Democratic Alliance, that they are our saviors. And I think that perception must be debunked. There are options, even if it's the 8th and the ANC that goes in. They might not get close to a 60% vote as they wish, but they might get it. And the EFF might surprise and say, even though we told you so, we're willing to come in whilst the DA is not there. Because it's the DA that drew that first red line and said, we don't want the EFF and the MK near us. It's them that threaten, that they don't want two black-dominated parties with significant support in this country near the talks. And there must be a reflection on conduct, what Advocate Professor Tuli Maronsela says, just attitude, behavior, and conduct can scupper an entire deal and takes down with it an entire society.
So that's also an important point, this dominant narrative about just the ANC and the DA being able to save South Africa. We saw the Rand losing more than 1% on news that the DA and the ANC are struggling to basically conclude this deal. So the markets, which is what we told about a lot, these markets are obviously, whoever controls the markets is controlling what needs to happen here.
But is it like that, Sakina? And should it be like that? Where I do agree with you. I mean, I remember writing a short piece not so long ago, and I let's say uttered the words. You go with the DA and the IFP, and you pacify the markets, and Washington in particular. Yes, the American government, I wish to be frank about that, because this thing was in part crafted in America. And I'm prepared to debate any analyst or anybody near the DA on this matter, right? The markets will be placated. But then, Sakina, you have to face a revolt from within other parties, even within your own ranks. If you go the other alternative, the so-called progressive alternative, and there's very little progressive about some of those parties, but you go the so-called leftist route, and you placate the internal constituencies, and you upset these so-called markets and business people and Western powers. Why can't there be a middle road in which even the EFF and MK understands that you have to grow the economy? The economy simply has to grow. There's no debate about this. It is what you do with the resources of that economy. So sometimes we do find ourselves, I'm afraid, in ideological binaries that countries that we revere for having given us these ideological trends and options, they seem to have moved away from it. China is running a state-led capitalist society. What Mr. Putin is running is far from a socialist running country. But we seem to cling on to these old ideological tendencies of the past to our detriment. Where they are correct, these leftist parties, it must be about the people, it must be pro-poor, it must be about uplifting society, and it must be about bringing to an end these devastating inequalities and poverty in Africa's so-called most industrialized state.
Well, Professor Chris Landsberg, thanks so much for your insights. Appreciated as always. Head of Diplomacy and Foreign Policy at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Chris Landsberg, teasing out for us the scenarios playing out as the nation awaits the announcement of cabinet. And we will let you know. We've got our ears and eyes on the ground. And as soon as there is movement, we'll let you know.